and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast by Bangalore International Centre.
I didn't know anything called mediation existed before. But Lauren Susskind and Chris Moore, from the United States, taught that one method of harmonizing environment and development was mediation. That with this, you could address conflict between disputants and work out ways in which both could come together to an agreement, which would be significantly better than an adversarial result. For me, this was my eureka moment. This is when the penny dropped into the slot, and I said, my God, this is it.
You just heard Sriram Panchu, renowned lawyer and pioneer of mediation in India, speaking with lawyer Kamala Naganand on the evolution of mediation as a successful dispute resolution mechanism. This episode of BIC Talks is an extract from a BIC stream session that took place on Friday, 23rd October 2020, titled Courting an Alternative. And with that, over to Kamala.
Thank you, Lekha. Good evening and welcome to all of you. Sriram has been one of the pioneers of the mediation movement in India. He is the face of mediation in India. He started his career in the chambers of Mr. Govind Swaminathan and has had a distinguished career at the bar. He was designated senior by the Madras High Court in 1996, and he has mediated significant public disputes from the Ayodhya dispute to the 60-year-old border dispute between the state of Assam and Nagaland. He's mediated commercial matters, family disputes, and has taught across universities around the world on mediation. He's also written many books, and in 2018, he was conferred by the Lawyers of India honor and designation by the Bar Council of India. So welcome, Sriram, to our conversation this evening. I'd like to start at the very beginning of your career and ask you, how did mediation interest you? And may I request you to start by sharing with us your journey in the law, and also side by side parallel it with mediation journey of India.
Thank you, Kamala, and thank you for the Bangalore International Centre for having me here. It's a pleasure to be with you. My journey, yes. I started my practice of law in 1976 with, as you said, Mr. Govind Swaminathan. It took me about 15 years in my profession to realize that something was wrong. And I had a growing sense of dissatisfaction with the way that the law was impacting the lives of my clients who were litigating. But invariably, their lives got worse. Even if they won their cases, their lives got worse. The relationships got worse. The problems with their companies got worse. And it just didn't seem to be, something which served people well in that part of the law, the conflict area. Anyway, I used to do a lot of public interest cases. I've always added stuff onto a conventional law practice. My conventional practice is commercial and constitutional law, but I've always added other things. So I used to do a lot of public interest cases. And in 1991, Dr. M.S. Swaminathan proposed me for the Salzburg Institute, the Salzburg Seminar. And for those of you who haven't been or don't know about it, I would suggest you check it out. It's a fantastic multidisciplinary gathering which takes place in Salzburg. They run something like 12 seminars a year on different subjects, ranging from philosophy to politics to law to journalism. And each of the seminars is you have about 30 people who are mid-career working in that field, and you have a few acknowledged leaders in that field. And they throw them all together for 2 weeks. There is just one formal lecture in the beginning, and after that, it's just discussion. It is the most energizing experience I've ever seen. It's, of course, in a beautiful setting. It's the same castle where they shot the film The Sound of Music. But as an experience, I think the Salzburg seminar has rarely left people's lives untouched. Most people who've gone there have had a significant change, in their lives. I wish somebody would start something like that in India. But anyway, the subject I went for was harmonizing environment and development. I didn't know anything called mediation existed before. But Lawrence Susskind and Chris Moore, from the United States, taught that one method of harmonizing environment and development was mediation. That with this, you could address conflict between disputants and work out ways in which both could come together to an agreement, which would be significantly better than an adversarial result. For me, this was my eureka moment. This is when the penny dropped into the slot, and I said, my God, this is it. This is what I've been looking for this method, this process, which will handle personal and civil conflict, commercial conflict. And for me, then on, it's been a very clear thing that the law is twofold. One part of the law, the adversarial system, must take care of cases of criminal law, cases of constitutional law, cases where you need an interpretation of a court or a direction of the court, and cases of severe imbalance, social impact cases. Everything else, I think, should go to mediation, or in some cases to arbitration, because it's much better resolved there. And so my work has been on that line from then. I came back to India and I started to speak and write about mediation. And for a few years, there was a lot of confusion. A lot of my friends thought I was going into meditation. There was this, why is Sriram going into deep breathing and pranayama? And this continued for some time, but I persisted. Cases would come, I would ask the lawyer for the other side. I would say that there is this thing called mediation, why don't we try it? And I would convert them to mediation. We would sit and mediate cases. And we started to get some interesting results. In 2001, my journey took me to New York. NYU invited me to teach a course on public interest law. And I agreed to go, provided I could do my research on mediation. And they, of course, they said yes, and they opened out all doors to me. So it was a very fruitful year teaching. I came back, and in 2005 was, I think, the Victor Hugo moment. There's nothing so powerful as an idea whose time has come. Following a conversation with Justice Kaju, who was Chief Justice at Madras, and I said, this is what mediation could do. But that man had the vision to say, we will introduce it as a regular part of the court. We'll create a mediation center and make it a division of the High Court. And he said, I'll give you rooms, I'll give you staff, I'll send you cases. I have no funds, will you manage? And I said, of course we will. So we took it up. We went up to lawyers, good lawyers, asked them to come and train as mediators. We brought in a first-class trainer from the US, trained them. Our dining tables went to the High Court to become mediation tables. But we started. And a lot depends upon your initial successes. And we had two initial successes. One I'll tell you about later. But the big one really was the case of Standard Motors, where a dispute which was lying in court for 12 years got sent down to mediation. Standard Motors, the company which made the Herald car, the company was wound up in 94, the assets had been sold. But for 12 years, the banks and the workers' unions were fighting about sharing the proceeds. The banks wanted 45 crores, the workers wanted 25. It was only 50 crores. And the money got just lying in court. 2006, June, a judge said, why don't we try this mediation? So they sent it down. In 3 months, we got a result. The banks came down from 45 to 30 crores. I remember that evening, at 4:30, I spoke with these bankers. And I said, look, if you're going to fight for 45 crores, and this is the thing about mediation, you must bring home to them your alternatives to settlement. I said, if you don't settle, you're looking at easily 12 years more of litigation. And God knows what the law will be at that time. You will not be on par with the workers. I said, if you settle today is 15 September, I will see that you get your money by the end of the month. And your half-yearly accounts. Your half-yearly accounts are good times to tell bankers to accept money and close. So they looked at me and they said, do you promise? I said, yes, I promise. Who was I to promise? But there's a God above. I said, yes, I promise. And within half an hour, they got back and said, yes, we agree. So they signed, the workers came down from 25 to 20, that wasn't the problem. And we had a lovely function, the Madras High Court, and the Chief Justice distributed the checks to the families of workers. And do you know how many there were? It was 2,196 workers.
Wow.
That number will never, go from my mind. In some cases, they died. The children came forward to receive the checks. And this made news. And then President Kalam, Mr. Kadru told him about the center. And the president actually wanted to come and visit. We were a one-year-old center. No president of India ever visits a one-year-old center. And when we got this news, I was surprised. I called his office and I said, "Is this for real?" And his secretary said, "No, sir, it's for real. He wants to come." His father was a mediator in their village. The president wants to see the center. So he came, and there is nobody, I think, the grace of God in a man as Dr. Kalam. And he came and he blessed it. And I think that made that just grow, it just grew exponentially. And we had a wonderful committee set up for the Supreme Court. Justice Lokur did a lot of work for that committee to take it all India. And within a short space, 15 years, you have mediation centers in every high court, district courts, and of course the Supreme Court. You have thousands of mediators. You have lakhs of cases being mediated across the entire spectrum of personal and commercial and civil conflict. So for India, I think it's been a great mediation march. Having said that, this is stage one. Stage two is the need to professionalize the practice, to bring in private mediation. It's only that way that mediation actually becomes sustainable, not just through court mediation, which is pro bono or honorarium. So we're working on that, how to professionalize it, how to make it remunerative and attractive for the mediator, but also for the lawyer. We need to create systems by which lawyers have a financial incentive to help parties to settle cases.
May I request you to hold that thought for a moment?
Yes.
I want to go back to the case that you just mentioned, and I'd like for you to share with us the most humanizing aspects of mediation as a form of dispute resolution. One or two examples where you've seen healing, where you've seen forgiveness, where you've seen empathy. These are the bottom line of any dispute resolution mechanism, because when you are in an adversarial system, what you end up seeing is only the negativity. But in order for any dispute to heal completely and to be cathartic, it needs, healing, it needs forgiveness.
I think, Kamala, the entire process is one of, it's a human process. Because what you do in mediation, you get people to communicate to each other. You get them to listen to each other. You get them to try and understand each other. You open up the framework, the larger picture, so that it's not just a disputant. You said, there is, in your session today, you use the word mindfulness. You get them to be mindful of the fact that in that dispute, there's not just themselves. There's also the community. There's also a family. There are also others. And they must be taken into account. That there is a long-term vision to things. That there are generations who matter. And then you actually get them involved in looking for solutions.
Which is the most amazing thing, right? That they are part.
That they get part of the process to resolve their own dispute. So let me give you a couple of examples quickly. I did a mediation some time back for a very large educational chain. Of course, I won't take names, but it consisted of father and sons, four sons, and one son, and the rest of the family had fallen out. And it was very bitter. And there are all kinds of cases, trust and criminal cases and civil cases, very, very bitter. And it came to the High Court, and Chief Justice Kaul told them, he said, look, if you continue litigating, in 20 years' time, you would have destroyed your institute, not 20 years. He said, in a short span of time, you will destroy your institution. You may fight for 20 years, but your institution will go very soon. He said, I'll give you a mediator, you try. It took me 8 months. Mediation is not easy. It's not easy. It can be very difficult because essentially you have no power with you. As a judge, you have the power. As a mediator, you have one power, which is to change the way people think, to think about themselves and a dispute. But some cases take a long time. This one took me 8 months. But at the end of it, we got a result where this young man said, I will leave the others, will be where they are. And the others decided to support him in another venture, non-competing. And today they're both flourishing. But earlier they spent all their time in courts of laws, cursing each other. Today they're flourishing. And I keep visiting them. And when I visit, I would say, how are you doing? And they would say, yes, we're doing well. Recently, this is what I hear. They not only tell me that, each one says, I'm doing well, but they also say, sir, the other branch is doing well. And, that is something which you get in mediation. I mean, it's, to me, having people sign an agreement, shake hands, and after shaking hands, an elder brother, a younger brother falling at the feet of the elder brother, or these two brothers hugging each other, or friends treating each other like, people who've fallen out, saying, we started our journey together in the 90s and we've fallen apart. Now let's get back together. This is common stuff. It's not at all unusual to me. I would say the sheer human aspect that we've fallen into conflict, now we can emerge from it. And having emerged, we can go back to being whole again and go back to being friends again. I had people from Coimbatore with me the other day. They were in a dispute for 12 years. The company law board sent them for resolution. They started at 11. By 2 o'clock, they were on the hunt for alternatives. By 5 o'clock, they had fashioned the essence of an agreement. By 7, they had decided. By 8, they had signed the agreement. They started at 11 in the morning. By 8 o'clock, they had reached the agreement, signed it. And then each of them started making frantic phone calls. And I said, who are you calling? They said, we're calling our children because although we've been fighting, our children stay best of friends. And they'll be the happiest people to know that this has happened. We are calling our respective children. I see this all the time in a mediation practice. I see the most humanizing elements of people coming out from there and humanizing and leading them to, the best of solutions. I could go on. I could take a whole evening and give you, case after case after case. But shall I give you one case which never goes away from my mind? This was the very first case in our mediation center which succeeded. This was a case of a contractor who had built a house and there were disputes between him and the owner wasn't paying the contractor's claim, and it came to mediation. It took about, I think, 3 or 4 sessions. And they came to an agreement, and the agreement was signed, and the check was handed over. And the minute the check was handed over, the contractor's wife, she used to come with him, she took me aside and said, sir, I have something to tell you. And I said, yes. And she said, my husband suffers from a serious disease, and we need this money for his treatment. And she said, we didn't want to say that in the negotiation because then, the other side might think it as a bargaining advantage. But now we have the check, I can tell you this. And I will never forget this one moment. When she left that room of that mediation center, that's our hall number 1, it's called mediation hall number 1. She turned around and she said, sir, I want to tell you, this is no ordinary room. It is a house of God. Whatever doubts I may have had that mediation will take root just got dispelled in that flash of that moment. I just knew there's no way this is not going to take root. House of God, what can you not do with it? So we still have that room. It's the most cherished room for mediation in the country. Every visitor comes and says, oh, is this where it all started?
How lovely. One of the criticisms that mediation has faced in recent times is that it has the potential to, people believe, entrench existing power imbalances like gender, employment, society between parties, and that mediation works best when equals are bargaining with one another. How would you react to this? And what can a mediator do to smooth over these imbalances?
Well, firstly, I would say you never get two equals. You always get people, but with differing strengths. But that's not really the point. I think the point is this, that you will get power imbalances in negotiating parties. And this arises out of the circumstances of the case. bear in mind that those power imbalances will get reflected in a court also, because the same power imbalance of, money and position will bear out in, let's say, in choice of a lawyer, getting a better lawyer. You get a power imbalance there as well. So I say, to some extent, you can handle the power balance in a mediation. And I think it is a duty of a mediator to handle that power balance. There are different schools of mediation. One is a school which says the mediator just runs the process. There is another school which says the mediator does more. He gets involved in the search for a good result. I belong to that latter school. And I do not believe in letting an unfair agreement go through my hands. There are times when I've told a party, look, the other side is willing for this, but I don't think this is fair, so I'm going to cancel this mediation unless you behave a little more reasonably. And invariably, they've said, yes, not to worry, sir, you tell us what it should be and we'll go by that. So I believe a mediator can, handle to some extent the imbalance, can certainly make sure that parties treat each other equally. That's very important. A mediator can make sure that parties treat each other equally, are given the same amount of respect, and can, in some ways, subtly alter the balance a bit. After all, when you have private conversations with each party, I do tell the stronger party, I do climb down them a little bit to say, you can twist the arm gently. As a lawyer, you can say, in the mediation, you do tell parties, you may not have the best case in the world. And I might spice that up a bit when I speak to a stronger party. So you bring them down a bit. But that's only up to a degree. Beyond a degree, you don't mediate those cases of power imbalance. I will not suggest that you mediate a case, where you have a dominant husband and a battered wife. No. You don't mediate a case where a company is like piling on all its, forces against one worker. You send those to a court of law, and you hope that in that court of law there is a judge who knows that he must constitutionally use his corrective sword, to rectify injustice. We can't rectify injustice here in mediation, but a judge can. So we must know when to send those cases off to the court.
Lovely. On that note, I'd like to move to public mediation in India. You've been part of several public mediations. So what do you think is the scope of public mediation in this world of constant conflict? And how effective has mediation been in resolving issues of public and national importance?
I think the term constant conflict that you use is right. This is a world of constant and heightened conflict. You get it in all parts of the globe, you get it increasing, and because the communication systems are so good, conflict just streams in at you, from wherever and whichever parts of the globe. So really conflict is so present and so strong a part of our lives. And every conflict, cries out for good resolution. Because when you start this search for saying, what are the commonalities? What are the larger interests out there? What things are more important to people? Then the answers you get will point you to the direction of conciliation, reconciliation, harmonizing, consensus, settlement. Because only through these that you can build better societies. And then you will know that there are ways, of tackling differences. I'll give you an example later when I talk about the Assam-Nagaland dispute. You see, the old days, we had people, we had politicians, we had leaders who knew how to build bridges. Their strength lay in the power to build bridges and to harmonize and to reach across. Today, you find today's leaders' strength lies in dividing people. And that is a huge problem for society. Question, therefore, is, can the court come in there? Is there a role for the court where the court can say we have a public dispute in front of us, we're going to mandate mediation? And to say that we will appoint a mediator, we will structure the process, we will oversee it, like the Supreme Court did in Ayodhya. And I think there is a role for the court. There is certainly a role, it's crying out there, there is a role for the court. Ayodhya was a bold start. I mean, it's very unusual that you would experiment with something by taking the ultimate case to experimentation. Yes. Although I wouldn't say it was the first time. In the earlier cases, Asamanagar, it was not their case. But I think there is a role for the court. There is certainly a need for both institutional bodies and citizen movements to work toward the area of harmonizing differences. It's not just institutional bodies like the court. We do need citizen movements also, which say that we press, we are keen to find resolution, we are keen that warring groups should come together, and we urge everybody to do that and to actively work towards that end.
Thank you for bringing Ayodhya up, because that was going to be my next question. You've had the rich experience of mediating Ayodhya. What are your learnings and experience of mediating that dispute?
Ayodhya is a fascinating case to mediate. You know, every mediator in the world is jealous of me because I got Ayodhya. I mean, it has everything in it. It has history. It has law. It has religion. It has court cases. It has violence. It has the huge communities of the world, battling each other. It had everything, every element of conflict. So to be given the great good fortune to be part of a mediation effort is, I think, a blessing of the Almighty. And for me, it was an amazing experience. I'm bound by confidentiality, so I cannot divulge what happened in mediation proceedings. There's much that I cannot talk about. But at this, I can say that my principal takeaway from Ayodhya is that, and this is not just from the mediation itself, it is from reading about Ayodhya from the time it started, is that when a public dispute breaks out, the most strongest voices are those on the margins, on the extremes. It is the extremist view which commands the most attention because their voices are the loudest, the most strident, and their acts can be negative, and all this grabs attention. This marginalizes people in the middle. It is the people in the middle who will be the larger number, who want a consensus, who want a solution, who want to move on, who don't want this to break society. But they get lost or marginalized, or they get shouted down or threatened, and some of them have to move towards the extreme ends. So I find that my conclusion is that if one has to deal with public conflict well, we must, as a country, build up that energizing, harmonizing voice in the middle. We must create the power of the commons, the people who say, no, we are one country, we want to find a resolution. If you are our leaders, find it for us. And I know this for a fact that if there had been that kind of groundswell of opinion, then a very wise leader of the Muslim Personal Law Board in the 80s, who advocated a form of a peaceful resolution, would have had his way. And he would have been met on the other side by wise Shankaracharyas. And the two of them together would have had their way to find a good resolution. Instead of which, it went into the hands of those who were more on the extreme margins. So this is my huge learning from Ayodhya. And from this is born the desire to work towards, creating a center for moderating dialogue. More on that later.
So what do you think our leaders today, both in government, in bureaucracy, should be thinking about of incorporating mediation? How do you think that, they could bring mediation into the mainstream?
Well, I would think that if I was, given charge of a blueprint for mediation, I would do the following. I would recognize that mediation has come center stage. I would recognize that the only way in which I can salvage the legal system is to create that center space for mediation, to professionalize mediation, to infuse its practice, incentivize it, and see to it that personal, commercial, civil, property conflict went off the courts and onto mediation tables. I would keep the courts for public, for constitutional cases, for interpretation of statutes, and for directions. I will also make the courts focus on cases of corruption. Corruption, not, your bus conductor corruption, but corruption of senior-most leaders. I would make the courts focus on that, and I would make the courts focus on serious crime like hate crimes and murders. And I would say that the courts got to these cases quickly enough. And if you move, the mass of commercial personal conflict off the courts can get to these cases quickly enough. Having done that, I think would be a place where you start. This would be a place where you start. And then I would view the court really, as, for me, the court is a protector of the Constitution. I don't see the court's role so much in resolution of private conflict. When the court gets in a private conflict, I feel our adversarial systems would make more damage than anything else. But to me, the court's primary role is a protector of the Constitution. We are an amazing country. We are a country which has the most wonderful constitution in the world. And that constitution is our Bible, is our Gita, is our Quran in our public space. In our private spaces, we have our religions, our respective religions. But in the public space, we have only one religion, and that is the Constitution. And we are marvelously lucky to have such a wonderful Constitution, which has every humane and civilized aspect in it, which has our freedoms and protections, our fundamental rights, our duties, our checks and balances. So, for citizens to swear allegiance to the Constitution and for the court to be seen as its ultimate protector is where I would like the system to go. And I would like to see cases of conflict being ironed out in a far more humane way. I think it's entirely doable. Nothing of this is asking for the moon. It's entirely doable, and it's doable within a short span of time.
The Assam and Nagaland dispute was another significant, sensitive matter that you mediated. Can you share with us that experience? And again, the outcomes and learnings from that.
Yeah, I spent close to 2 years in that dispute, 2010 to 2012. I've never been to Northeast before, and that took me almost every 3 days in a week, 2 weeks I was in Guwahati or Dimapur or somewhere in that. It is amazing because it was a 60-year-old dispute over their entire border between Assam and Nagaland, stretching 500 miles, square kilometers, in 7 districts. And they had fought over this from the 1960s and had lost hundreds of lives. And they had a case in the court pending from 1988. And when it came to hearing, Justice Kadru again, he said, what is the point? We will decide for one state against the other, and you will keep fighting, and there will be violence. We'll give you a mediator, you try. So one thing I found was a willingness to engage in mediation. Just the fact that, we could get people to talk was enough for people on the ground, to give them a sense of hope and say, let's not engage in any fighting. There is some effort to speak. There was a willingness on the part of the administrators, the willingness on the part of the chief ministers. They actually wanted a resolution. And at one point, maybe we could have had a resolution in terms of, exchange of some territory, plus some very innovative methods, because ultimately these are two, states within a union. These are not two different countries. And one thing I found in the Assam Nagaland case, which is a classic mediation lesson, this is the story of the orange. The 2 girls fight over an orange. A judge will say, well, I'll look into law and I'll see where did this tree grow, in which of your parents' compounds, and where was the overhang, and I'll decide who owns the orange. And an arbitrator will say, well, maybe I'll give you 50-50. But a mediator will ask the question, he will say, why do you need the orange? And because they're talking to the mediator in trust, they will open up. And one girl just might say, I need it to make juice. And the other might say, I need the skin to make marmalade. And therefore, you have a solution where you can give both of them the maximum. It's one of these creative out-of-the-box solutions. Then you get plenty of them in mediation. When you actually get people talking as to why they want something, you will very often find that one person wants something for one reason and the other wants it for another reason. And this translates all the time. I've seen couples coming to mediation and the husband saying, I won't give up this house, it's my family property. Because when he says, I won't give up the house, you say, why? He says, my family property. And you ask the wife, why do you want this house? And she says, I need it to stay and for the children to go to school. They're completely different reasons as to why 2 people want the same thing. But once you know that, you can craft, answer. So go back to Assam and Nagaland, and you discover that one side wants the land because they cannot be seen as having given it up. And the other side wants the land because they want to use it. So these are completely, different reasons. And we have enough in our constitution, the 5th and 6th schedule, which could have helped us to create councils which will satisfy the needs of both sides. But the whole of Assam got locked into a huge conflict because of a conclave exchange between India and Bangladesh. And therefore, for reasons out of our control, we found we couldn't proceed, with land issue. But what we did do, which again is interesting, is we created border peace committees comprised of Assamese and Nagas in each district. And we kind of empowered them and, made sure they were recognized and given a car with a flag and all kinds of amenities. And these committees, have been so useful that whenever some issue breaks out, they get to the site of the clash and they diffuse it because they're both Assamese and Nagas and respected people in these committees. And they've kept the peace. I've rarely heard of a border clash over the last so many years. So I think when you empower people, you energize them, you infuse them, you'll get results.
And it's also a question of justice in their hands, right? They are the ones who are facilitating the outcome. And they are the ones who are negotiating it, accepting it, and sharing it with their community. And I feel like, in the courts, of course, courts definitely have a place for it. But in certain instances, it really is finding a creative solution amongst parties. And the more that it's done by these individuals themselves, the higher the chances of it being accepted on both sides, implemented, and continue to maintain good relationships. So in hindsight, what role do you think mediation could have played to resolve complex historic conflicts such as the Kaveri dispute between Karnataka and Tamil Nadu?
Well, it may not be just hindsight. I don't think that conflict has gone away anywhere. So you could very well have that back on a mediation table at some stage. But I think it is this. I think it is to engage people on the ground from both the states, especially people who are affected by this and people who are knowledgeable. And I know that years back, there was an effort in the direction. Farmers from Tamil Nadu were engaged with farmers in Karnataka in sitting down and seeing how this could be resolved. And there was a very good monograph brought out on that. And to anybody who's interested in looking at the Kaveri dispute, I would suggest please read that monograph. It's authored by S. Gohan, and it gives you a very interesting insights on how you can actually resolve it. And what it proposes is to say, let's change the model from sharing in terms of TMC, volume, to sharing in terms of percentages. So that when we have problems, we share in terms of percentages. One side is not totally deprived. It's a very interesting model. But it is a case, and once you go through that process, I think then people on both sides emerge with a better understanding of each other. Till then, it's all about demonizing the other. You want to make us starve. You want our ground to run dry. But when you get understanding, then you get this thought that maybe we should find some things which suit both of us, which is the only way. I cannot think of any other way. What other way would you have?
Can we now move to a more international perspective? In 2019, over 45 member states of the United Nations, including India, Iran, Israel, and the United States, came together to sign the Singapore Mediation Convention. How significant a development is this?
I think it's a huge development. The Singapore Convention is called the UNCITRAL Convention on Enforcement of International Mediation Settlement Agreements. Now, this basically provides that if you have a mediation settlement between a person or entity of one country and one of another, an Indian company, an American company, for example, that agreement is enforceable and has a strength of virtually of a decree of court. So you can take it to any country which is a signatory to the convention, file it, and say, I want it to be enforced. And you don't have to go through the process of filing another suit all over again. The court will take it as though it is a full-fledged decree and send it on to enforcement. And as you know, for a mediation agreement, there is no defense. You cannot reopen it on a question of fact. There are no defenses to somebody who signed a mediation agreement, and the court will not entertain a defense. So it is virtually automatic implementation and enforcement, which is something business people don't have in adversarial litigation nor in arbitration. Sometimes their bigger headaches start after they have an award in their hand and they go to try to implement it. But the mediation, you have no backstops. So this answers, in fact, the one need of business to say, we have a mediation agreement, how do we enforce it? The Singapore Convention now gives you a brilliant method of enforcement.
What is the scope of mediation in international matters when countries are at loggerheads and the ramifications of their disputes are far-reaching?
I think there is a scope, but it has to come. You see, in all mediations, you have to get a mediation panel appointed by somebody. Either the parties themselves appoint a mediator, or it is a body like the court which appoints a mediator. So I think, in fact, I think the United Nations was to engage in forming a mediation force, that the UN has a peacekeeping force. If the UN actually, formed a mediation group and lent the services of this group to countries engaged in conflict, so that it would be perceived as a neutral group, backed by, the power, the authority of the UN, the model authority of the UN, I think it goes a significantly long way. Because at the end of the day, when people get locked into conflict, they get locked into it, they respond to things which are happening, there is violence, there is counter-violence, sometimes it goes out of the hands of leaders, and then it's a massacre, it's flames all over, they don't know what to do themselves, it's a slippery slope. And therefore, the UN said, we will actually, we can mandate, we can suggest a mediation, we can send you the people, you can start with it. It provides a way out for the leadership, and it provides a calming influence on ground.
So in the last 5 years, we've seen that there have been a lot of private mediation institutes that have come out all over India. What, according to you, is the role of an institution in the mediation process? Does it play as significant a role as the mediator himself?
I think the roles are different. The institution is meant to run it more conveniently, to administer it, to bring, to have a set of rules, but to enhance the quality of the mediation, the process. The institution may have mediators on its roll, so people could go and say, look, give us the mediator from your list. Or the institution can serve to bring independent mediators, but offer its facilities. It may have rules. One thing it can do is to structure the fee system, so that if you have a standard fee system, people feel more relaxed with that. Also, to keep a check on, whether mediations are really running into too long sessions, to keep a check on time. So these are useful things that an institution can do. And it is good to have institutions, because then that will, I think, give people more confidence in approaching mediation.
I'd now like to move to private mediation and look at, commerce and industry. With most large businesses being family run in India, when there is a shareholder dispute, like the one between Tatas and the Mistries, do you think that mediation could play a role in conflict resolution?
I certainly think so. And I certainly it's something which should be tried before people, go to litigation. Or even if they had to go to litigation, you get your interim order necessary, then go to mediation. Because, the toxic effect of dispute gets multiplied when it's a family business. Because then things are not just boardroom, it is boardroom and living room, and it's members of a family. And sometimes it's not just members of family, it's members of a community. I think the Tata's Mistries fight was disaster. It was disaster for the two groups, the Tatas and the Mistries. It was disaster for the number of companies, which even saw, I think, independent directors taking, some sides, taking sides with Ratan Tata, some with sides with Mistry. And it was disaster for the community. A community which prided itself on having the Tatas, as their foremost kind of emblematic, iconic figures, I think just got shattered. And not just the community, so do the rest of us. We've always given the Tatas a certain primacy when it comes to values and humanism. And I think it was shocking for us to see, what happened in this case. Especially sad to see kind of, extra adversarial and aggressive behavior from the Tatas. It is almost as though they had left their legal department in charge of this whole dispute and said, you guys lead us. And that is disaster, because you all know what legal departments do. They're meant to, for adversarial conflict. They're not meant to give you wise leadership. not meant to give you wise guidance. A legal department in most companies is like, what did Mark Twain say? He said, if your only tool is a hammer, then every problem needs a nail. And legal departments are like that. They're used to being adversarial. They think everything should go to the operation table or to the surgical ward. So to have needless aggressive behavior was really sad for us, and I think they did a lot of damage. It would have been so much better if they'd gone to, and there are wise counselors they knew, they would have known, and said, help us to find a way out of this. At the end of the day, Cyrus Mistry would have known that there's no way he could hold on to chairmanship if the Tatas didn't want him. But I think what upset the man was his being asked to go in this manner. And at the end of the day, I don't think Ratan Tata wanted him out in that manner. I think something went wrong in that communication. And I'm sure if they had a chance to sit across the table, they could have rectified it. Neither of them wanted this kind of end, this kind of process, this ugly ballooning of conflict and this end. So it's a pity that they didn't go, to a resolution process. In fact, I think I would strongly advise, for large companies, please get yourselves in terms of, when you have these kind of cases, think of going to a dispute resolution advisor, who can really advise you to say, look, for this kind of dispute, try this process, and who would structure the mediation for you. We have very senior judges who are good mediators. We have other wise people who are good mediators. Get them involved. See if you can sort it out. If you can't, go to court. But try it this way first.
I'd like to move also to the family mediation, where we're seeing that there are a lot of family disputes, not only divorce, where interests of all parties and all stakeholders have to be looked at. How do you ensure the interests of all the parties are safeguarded? I'd also like for you to please focus on children.
I think when you have family disputes or family mediation, there are two kinds. One is your, family mediation, let's say, which is having a matrimonial dispute. And I think a mediator there must pay a special regard to the plight of children. Children are the unseen parties at the table, but they are, I think, the most important parties. Beyond a certain stage, you give a damn about what husband and wife do to each other. They can run their own life. It's the children who really affect you. So I think we caution our mediators to pay a special regard to children. I think in our processes, we must enhance that to make sure we have psychologists who take care of children's needs when their parents are going through a dispute. And every mediator, when it has a mediation result, must take care that the interests of children are protected. You cannot have a mediation agreement go through your hands where sufficient care and provision is not made for the children. When it comes to a family business, for example, the mediator should remember that there are generations here who will be impacted by this decision. And therefore, one must take care again, to provide for equity over there. I do know now that there is a practice, several people have started approaching for this, where they say, help us for succession planning. We want to do succession planning. We realize that disputes are probably, quite inherent to crop up. So help us to fashion a dispute resolution methodology. And I think that helps because if the patriarch of the company fashions the dispute succession plan and nominates a dispute resolution system, for example, nominates a mediator, then it makes it much easier when there is dispute. People can access this person instead of fighting about what to do. So wise, I think good heads of family business outfits are doing this to look to the future and set in force a dispute resolution mechanism. They're doing the wise thing of expecting dispute. Don't get surprised by dispute. Expect it, deal with it, fashion the instruments for it, then you're fine.
I'd like to share an experience with you where I was representing one of the parties in a divorce proceeding. And it was a very long day, and we started at 9 a.m. and finished by 12 midnight. But at the end of it, what was really, really satisfying for me as a lawyer was to see that the husband and wife started having a conversation, and they left that mediation together to go and speak to their children and let them know of the outcome. And I think that has been one of the most satisfying experiences for me as a lawyer, because all interests in all parties were looked at, and there was a resolution which was amicable. And people, yes, have disagreements, but they continue to live life in a more holistic, peaceful manner. And those children at the end of it didn't have to choose between their parents and could continue to have healthy relationships in their lives going forward.
That's amazing, and congratulations, because it's not only a successful mediation outcome, you also ensured the well-being of those children's lives in terms of being able to establish and maintain contact with their respective parents freely and without having to worry. So, you virtually ensure that they're able to, develop into harmonious adults. So it's a great achievement. Congratulations.
Thank you. So, you've lent your name to so many impactful projects and had such an amazing career. What next? What are the new initiatives that you're looking at? And would you like to share some of those with us?
Yes, I would like to. Thank you for this question. I'd like to share with you 3 initiatives. And this is born out of a small group of us. This is headed by Justice M.N. Venkatachalaya, our former Chief Justice, who's our Bhishma Pitama, and Justice T.S. Thakur, one of our most respected Chief Justices, Justice Ravindra and myself, and Mr. Sadish Pai. We've created a body called the Mediation Promotion Trust. The work of this body is to create new initiatives in mediation. Now, this body is going to create 2 new initiatives, and very briefly I'll tell you about them. One is a Center for Mediation Studies and Research, which will look at existing, trends, identify long-term trends, look at new areas of mediation, extension of existing areas, go into the world of business, go into, world of government, using mediation for government, and fostering research and writing. Right now, we are full up because the Bar Council asked for our help in formulating the mediation component of a full-scale 45-hour semester program for the law schools. And the Chief Justice is urging, they've mandated that should be compulsory now. And they've asked for our help in formulating that. And I have a wonderful team which works on that. So we're formulating that program. And the Bar Council also said, will you help us to train the teachers for it? Mm-hmm. At the rash moment, I said, yes. And then I asked them, I said, how many teachers? And they said, sir, 1,200 law schools.
Oh, wow.
So, but it's feasible. We have online processes now, and we have excellent mediators in all the states, most states. So it's not a problem at all. We'll get them together to administer the teaching. So this is a Center for Mediation Studies and Research. The other institution which we're starting under this is a Center for Moderating Dialogue. And this is squarely what I told you about my experience in Ayodhya. That there is a need for a group of people to foster this dialogue, to focus on it, to encourage writing, research, thinking, speeches, TV programs, but to keep the need for moderating dialogue foremost in the public mind, to give the possibilities of dialogue and resolution, and to actively, concretely push for it. It needs work, it needs action, it needs momentum. I mean, Edmund Burke said this in the 1700s, he said, all that is necessary for forces of evil to triumph is that the good do nothing. So all it needs for good people to get engaged in things like this and will carry the day. So this is a center for, for moderating dialogue. I hope they will, will be able to do good work. We've already been approached for some major cases of public dispute. Third is a very different kind of project. And it again takes me to the humanizing part of this program today. And this is a project called the Gratitude India Foundation. It's born out of 2 very simple concepts. One, how can we make gratitude a stronger and a more foundational element of our lives? And this is by, reading about it, sharing experiences, getting quotations, getting anecdotes. But along with that, to actively practice gratitude as giving, concrete acts of giving. I've been developing a very simple mechanism, for example, an app which will help you to give at the time we are most grateful, and which is the time we have a meal. We thank the Lord for our meal. And if we can have an app which we're developing, say, well, hit this button, and whatever money you want goes to somebody who needs a meal. Yes. And there are other ways of practicing gratitude. This can grow. And we want to create a community of gratituders, of people in gratitude. And the one thing we're doing is to ensure that we raise funds separately for this body so that the donor, no part of the money given by a donor is deducted for running this organization. The entirety goes to the beneficiary. We also want to form clusters of people, who are part of this community, so that in their own area, whether it's in Bangalore, Hyderabad, or wherever, part of a company or part of a school or college group, they can say, well, here's a group of us, we'll form a cluster, we'll raise our funds, we'll find a local NGO to support, and we're happy with that. We just want to start a community, we just want to get it going. So these are 3 projects. If any of you who on this are interested, just drop me a line at srirampanchu@gmail.com. I'll make sure that somebody will get in touch with you. And yes, these are the 3 things I wanted to talk about. Thank you for the opportunity.
Lovely. Thank you so much for your very patient answers to all these questions. I really, really learned a lot and enjoyed this conversation. I just want to say thank you to BIC.
Thank you, Kamala. I must thank you for being, a very, very good interlocutor. My congratulations and thanks.
Thank you for hanging in there and listening to the full conversation. If you liked what you heard, do share it with friends and family. You can also leave us a review or rating on iTunes and Apple Podcasts. The crew behind this podcast is Gaurav Krishna on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Raghu Tenkaila. Episode artwork and design is by Chandni Venkataraman. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. This is Lekha Naidu, signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.